I would make conferences make sense again.
Welcome to Saturday's Warrior, the proud member and BYU representative of the College Huddle. Now, if you're like Josh Pate and feel that conference realignment has gotten completely out of hand and gone way too far, then you are in the right place. So please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, a few weeks ago, probably about a month ago at this point, Josh Pate put out a video outlining how he would ideally have the conferences aligned if he were the commissioner, if he had all the power to do so. And this is pretty similar to a video we put out last fall where we did the same thing. And surprisingly enough, Josh Pate actually gets a lot of it right. He gets pretty close on this, but he's still a little bit off the mark. Now, we wanted to comment on this video back when it was fresh, but couldn't get to it. But now that realignment is back at the forefront of discussion, we wanted to take this chance to go ahead and take a look back at what Pate outlined and show what he got wrong and how he could improve it. So without any further ado, we want to pull up his video and we'll talk through it and outline, our thoughts on the matter. All right, let's pull up our screen and now roll film. So for you kids out there, that's called a VCR.
In the future, if you're the commissioner, you could just executive order your way around anything and everything. What would you do? Well, I know exactly what I would do. I'd fix conferences.
Yes.
Conferences don't make sense in college football. Conferences used to make geographical sense. Size-wise, they made sense numerically. And I'm also going to tell you some moves that I'm going to make. And I'm also going to tell you some protocols, some guidelines that I've put in place here.
And we'll get into those as we follow along. We'll talk about those as he gets to them. So he's going to start here. He's going to go through conference by conference and how he would align them. I will give you one guess as to which conference he's starting with.
Hey, where else would we start? You know the reputation of this show. Let's show them what the SEC would consist of, because there are some big changes in the SEC. The first thing you'll notice is there's an absence of Texas and Oklahoma. Well, they're not in the SEC anymore. They shouldn't be in the SEC now.
They shouldn't.
Where's Vanderbilt? Vanderbilt's not in the SEC anymore either. They've been here for over a decade. Well, not no mo. Do you also notice there are only 10 teams? That's because there is no conference with more than 10 teams. And I'm going to tell you why. Because every single conference out there is going to include a schedule where everybody plays everybody. Instead of this lunacy that sees Florida play half of the top 10 teams in the country, and I got Missouri just skating through.
Yeah, he got this exactly right, that you got to have smaller conferences, not only, more traditional, more regional, but really staying at that 10 number is the sweet spot. Now, he has some conferences that aren't 10 teams exactly. And in my scenario, I would have every conference at 10 because there are currently 70 teams at the Power 4 level. I'm including Notre Dame in that right now. And, well, I'm also including Oregon State and Washington State in there, and that gets you 270. And so that would give you 7 conferences, 10 each, and that's the perfect number. In football, you can play 9 in-conference games, play everybody round robin, and clearly define who the top 2 teams are. You can still have a conference championship game and have those teams square off and crown very clearly and emphatically who the conference champion is that year. You don't have to go on all these crazy tiebreakers. There probably are scenarios where you'd still run into some tiebreakers, but it would not be insane like it is now. And you wouldn't have, as he pointed out, the crazy imbalance in schedule with these schools. And so then imagine a playoff where you have these 7 power conferences and 7 of the 7 very clearly defined champions, no matter if you take it to 7, 8, 12, 16, whatever teams, you would still have all those clearly defined conference champions. The rest of the details, we actually covered that in a separate video You can go check that one out after watching this video as well. But that's another conversation. But I think this would go a long way towards supporting it. And then when you think about basketball, that would give you 18 conference games, a home and away with every conference opponent. 10 is just the best number all around. And so you got that right. So before we move on to the next conference, I want to look at how I would have the SEC lined up here. And we're pretty similar. Obviously, you're getting rid of these newcomers. A&M is no mo, like he said. And the only real difference I have here is that I'd still have Vanderbilt in the SEC. Sorry, South Carolina, you came in after. I mean, the SEC came around in I want to say 1932, and they're not all the founding members because there's others like Tulane, that Georgia Tech, that left that are no longer with the SEC. But out of all the current members that were founders of the SEC, you got 10. So you stick with those 10, and they've all had longstanding, rivalries and tradition playing with each other. And so to me, that is the perfect SEC. All these other guys are going to have homes elsewhere. All right. So let's move on with the next conference. I'll let
Let's
you
go
guess
to the
which
Big
one
Ten,
that
Colin.
is.
Who are we going to put in there? More importantly, whom are we taking out? I have removed Maryland via executive order from the Big Ten because I don't think they belong there. Rutgers does not belong there. There is no West Coast team in the Big Ten because there shouldn't be.
No,
because
there
conferences are about geography. They're about territory. Big Ten football, as a phrase, used to mean something.
Yeah, absolutely. Here, before we move on to the next conference here. So, yeah, I think he outlined it pretty well. I mean, it's pretty clear which teams should move out. Obviously, all the Pac schools, they make no sense in the Big Ten. And then your other latecomers, Rutgers and Maryland, those still don't feel like Big Ten schools. Nebraska kind of did. They felt like a good kind of segue. But again, latecomers, even Penn State. And this is where Josh Pate and I differ, is he kicked out Notre Dame, much like Vanderbilt, kicking out these longstanding members. I mean, the Big Ten has been together a very long time, not since last century, but since the end of the prior century. The conference was founded, and Northwestern was part of that. So to kick them out seems very bizarre to me, even though based on performance, especially when he's trying to go back to tradition. Penn State feels like they've been in the Big Ten forever. It's only been since 1991. And so while, yes, that is a long time, it is not nearly as long as these other schools. Even Michigan State joined much later than a lot of these other schools, but still 45. So I think it's pretty clear cut. You just go with the oldest members and you keep them, and that gives you a very traditional looking Big Ten that I think everyone can get behind. And again, don't worry, all these other guys are going to have homes.
I'm bringing the Southwest Conference back. I'm bringing all the old school teams back.
That's
I'm
right.
throwing Arkansas over there. So Arkansas is not in the SEC anymore. I'm putting them back in the Southwest Conference. Oklahoma, this will be a little controversial because OU was not in the original SWC. And
Yes,
aside from that,
that's
it's just a bunch of the
controversial.
Texas schools. And they may look at this and say, oh, that'll never work. Just a bunch of Texas teams? Who's going to watch that? Ton of people.
Oh, yeah.
Ton of people will. Because this is the way college football is supposed to be presented to them. I elevated
100%.
Rice, which is kind of inexplicable. The only reason you're
Not kind of inexplicable. It's very inexplicable, but let's see what he has to say.
This conference is due to legacy and tradition and history. You really don't belong at this table right now.
No, they don't belong at the table. So I completely agree. Bring back the Southwest Conference. And yes, you're bringing back those Texas schools. And SMU's lucky that they bought their way into the ACC because that makes them eligible as a power school to get into the Southwest Conference. Rice is not eligible. Like I already said, we're already at 70 power conference teams. You don't need to elevate anybody. And if you were going to elevate a school, it certainly would not be Rice. There are so many schools ahead of them, more deserving. And then OU, I see what he's doing there, wanting to keep the Red River rivalry together. Can't believe I got that out. That existed prior to the Big 12. It can continue to exist. They'll continue to play while being in different conferences. So I'm actually reserving those 2 slots elsewhere. And OU, they've also got a more traditional conference home to return to, which we'll get to right now.
The Big 8 is back, not the
Mhm.
Big 12. No, none of that. It's a conference called the Big 8. It's going to have 8 teams in it. Colorado,
See, and this is where I would still go to 10 teams, but it's okay. I think he's on the right track here.
State, both the Kansas schools, Nebraska's back there, Missouri's back there, Oklahoma State, Utah.
I think it's hilarious how he just throws in Utah and doesn't even acknowledge that, that they're a newcomer. He just kind of brushes over that. So let's see. Yeah, the Big 8 is another one that they're down a couple members, but we'll come back and fill in those remaining members for both of these conferences, because these 2 were a little bit harder to fill than the others, but in the end, it'll all work out. So we'll get to that. And but yeah, I mean, you've got this traditional Big 8 right here together, and then we'll talk about the next 2, but it just makes sense. So that is why I have OU not in the Southwest Conference. Sure, they could be a fit there. You could put OU and OSU together in the Southwest Conference to fill this spot, but I think there is another solution that just fits all around better when you look at all the conferences as a whole. So let's get into that.
The ACC is where it's going to get a little controversial. So I'm throwing Maryland back in the ACC.
That's not controversial.
Some of the other teams that are usually over there are over there. However, because of what I'm going to do in just a second with the Big East, there are a number of teams in the ACC that are notably absent. Number 1, Syracuse sitting there. Well, that's because they don't belong in the ACC.
No, they
They're
don't.
going back to where they belong. So is Boston College.
Good.
So is Louisville. So is Virginia Tech. So there you go. 10 teams in the ACC. Everyone's going to play everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. He's on board, or I'm on board with him on this one. We're going with the ACC and kicking out all those Big East schools. Why you would think the way he queued up the Big East, that would be the next conference he covers, but it's not. So we'll get to Big East in a moment. But yeah, for the most part, I'm aligned with him on this. I think there's a couple schools he has different. I know he's got Miami in there. For me, you have the original 8 members, which UVA technically wasn't original. They came in later that first year. But I mean, basically all the founding members, and then the next 2 schools to join, Florida State and Georgia Tech. So again, we are going back again to tradition, to our roots, and we're bringing back more regionality, and it's going to feel more like the old Tobacco Road. Yeah, there's some schools outside of that, but that old conference. Oh, and I mentioned South Carolina earlier. We're bringing them back. They're back in conference with Clemson. They really, they left the ACC to get into the SEC, which was the opposite of Georgia Tech. Regardless, both of them are in the ACC, and it feels right.
Back because the Pac-10 is coming back. The Pac-10 was always the easiest conference to memorize. You had the 2 Washingtons, you had the 2 Oregons, you had the 2 LA schools, you had the 2 Arizonas, and then you had the 2 Bay Area schools. And that's the 10. Just so simple.
It really is so simple. There's not much more to say to that. You got the Pac-10 coming back. Wazoo and Oregon State get a lifeline thrown to them, and they're together. But there you have it, walking down. You got, starting, from the northwest corner, you got the Washington schools, then you got the Oregon schools, you got the Bay Area, Southern California, and then you got the Arizona schools. It's that easy. Nothing more to say about that, other than it does suck a bit for BYU and Utah, because regionally the Pac was always the best fit. Utah would love to be back in that conference, but again, the Pac-10 was a longstanding conference, and Utah and BYU were not a part of that. So we'll get another home for them. But let's continue here.
And then I've got to bring back the Big East. I haven't mentioned Virginia Tech. Well, that's because they're going to be in the Big East.
You did.
Because they were in the Big East. I'm throwing West Virginia in the Big East because I don't like that their closest home game is like 1,000 miles away right now.
You don't like
and
it?
He's got
How do you
UConn
think they
in
feel?
the Big East. Congratulations. So is Louisville. So is Pitt, and Cincy, and Boston College. UCF. That was the one. Look, deal with it. There are bigger things to worry about than UCF not historically having been in the Big East, but I put them there. That's because they're currently a Power 5 caliber team, and I wanted to slot them somewhere, and they didn't really fit anywhere else.
It makes sense. I actually have it a little bit different. I don't have UCF here, and I'll explain why in just a moment. But theoretically, I don't disagree with his thought process on it. But I came up with different numbers. I have uh, 10 schools in the Big East. Now, you'll notice down there in that corner, we've got Notre Dame. I know that they've fought hard about ever joining a conference, that they do not want to join a conference. But in this world, again, I'm as Josh Pate put it, I'm commissioner. I get to make the rules. I get to say how it's going to be. And for me, Notre Dame can't continue to be on the fence. They can't continue to get special treatment, be treated like a power conference of one school and have as much say as all these other power conferences, or more say, I would say in some cases. So for me, it's you gotta squat or get off, or what is it? You gotta get off the pot or whatever. So I butchered that, but you know what I'm trying to say. They got to make a decision, and a lot of people would want to put them in the Big Ten, but that's never happened. They've resisted that, and the Big Ten is already locked up with their 10. Whereas the Big East, Notre Dame used to play there in their other sports, and so I think it's a great fit for them. And then all these other schools outside of Penn State were all together in the Big East at some point, and Penn State really. I know they made their way to the Big Ten, and that was good for them. But regionally, they're a better fit with a lot of these other schools, and that puts them in the conference with Pitt, which would be a lot of fun, with West Virginia. And so I just think it makes a lot of sense. The Big East Conference name. Now, I know Josh Pate, like, for example, says the numbers have to be right, the Big Eight, and I'm going to put 10 schools in there. That's not as big of a concern for me. They'll figure the name out. Same with the Big East. They won't be able to keep the Big East name because you've still got that conference with the basketball schools, and that's where the name belongs. So they can figure out something else. They can call it the new Big East or the football Big East, whatever. And but we'll refer to it for the sake of this as the Big East, and have those schools back together. So let's, as I mentioned, Notre Dame, let's go ahead and see what he has to say on them.
Notre Dame's going to maintain their independence, which that's just normal. That's been normal for most of our lifetimes. Brigham Young's going back to being independent. It's just a numbers thing, and you guys have been in.
Okay, Notre Dame, I understand, and I'll actually circle back to Notre Dame's independence here in a moment at the end of the video. But BYU, I mean, come on, we just got into power conference. BYU does not want to be kicked out and be independent, but also we just got the Holy War back together in conference, and you're going to tear it apart again? I mean, come on, man.
Been it before. Northwestern's going to be independent.
I've already talked about them.
And they're one of the least relevant football programs in that conference, but they are one of the charter members. And I know that. I know my history. I know, but I'm going on product on field today. Vanderbilt. Tough luck, especially because of this past year, but I got to throw you guys in the independent pile too.
Okay. Again, you're going to kick them out and make them be independent after their long-standing tradition in their conferences, but you're going to elevate Rice because of tradition to get them back into the Southwest Conference. I'm sorry. Rice is just out. Like, it stinks because all these other members, even SMU, all these other guys are back together. The band's back together. Rice is out. It stinks for them. I'm sorry. But that one, I just think he got wrong. So anyway, let's finish up here.
So this is where I want to go, because I was told I can do whatever I want. This is where I want to go with college football. This is where I want to go with conferences. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying it's close enough to perfect for me.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. But I'm going to show you how, as I've continued to do, show you how I think it could be just a little bit more perfect. But I think he's really on to something. What I had noticed is, as you put these conferences back together, you end up with these two pockets. You got these Florida schools, this pair of Florida schools that don't have a home, and these pair of Utah schools that don't have a home. Now, as I already mentioned, this conference would probably work best for them. There's a couple that would work really well for them, but the numbers just don't come out. And so we have to get a little bit more creative with it. But I think the best scenario for these schools would be for Miami and UCF to together be in the Southwest Conference and BYU and Utah in the Big Eight. Now you'll say Florida schools in the Southwest Conference, that doesn't make any sense. They are in the South, but they're also about as east as, especially Miami, they're about as southeast as you can get in our country. So geographically, in terms of the name, doesn't make sense. Again, I'm not as locked in on that as Pate is. For me, I think that really there are a number of conferences. Yes, these big power conferences, but also in Conference USA, wherever. I think Sunbelt now that have schools in both Florida and Texas, it's not unheard of, and really, I think flying, it's not as far apart as it kind of feels and sounds. Also, you have the Utah schools, which are right there. They border with Colorado, so you got kind of that contiguous states that are all there, and I think they fit pretty well in the Big Eight. And then you look at this and you think you have Bedlam, you get the border war, you get whatever Nebraska and Colorado rivalry is, Farmageddon, you get the Holy War. I mean, those are some fantastic rivalry names, and even better rivalries. This would just be an incredible conference. Imagine rivalry weekend and these teams actually playing on rivalry weekend, playing all in one conference. It would just be so much fun. So I think that is a great fit for them. And again, you got to kind of squint a little bit to make sense with it, with these Florida schools. But I think everything else falls into place so well that you can kind of make an exception there. And I think with how perfect everything else is, you just go with it for them. And let me pull up a map here so you can see what this would look like. Very nice indeed for me. And you can tell that, the circles to match the colors and the logos. Got a lot of blue here, but the Big East one is with the red circles around it. But it just makes sense. But now there is another option that I would be open to if you really can't get past these Florida schools being here in the Southwest Conference. And that would start with moving BYU and Utah to the Southwest Conference. Now, they're not really in the South, just like Miami and UCF aren't in the West, but they are at least in the West. So they got half of it right either way. But for the Big Eight, you're not moving the Florida schools into the Big Eight because that just makes the problem worse. They're even farther apart than they are from the Texas schools, and even make even less sense geographically, culturally, and all that. So I would not put them in the Big Eight. I would then put those schools in the Big East. And we did talk about that. Josh Pate had UCF in the Big East. Again, Miami had been there previously, so that also makes sense. And UCF, even though they haven't been there traditionally, USF, South Florida was, and so they're kind of just taking their place. And I know they're rivals, and neither one of them wants to be compared to each other, but that's essentially what would be happening in that case. But that would also mean to do that, you would have to be kicking out two schools from the Big East, and those would happen to be Cincinnati and Louisville, who are on the eastern portion. Obviously, Notre Dame is not going to be moved out, or on the most western side of the conference. Sorry. And actually, if you look at the map, the man in the middle. If you look at the states, you got Missouri, who's the belly that touches Kentucky. So really, that's contiguous states as well. And those two schools seem like they would be somewhat of a fit culturally as well with the Big Eight. They seem to kind of to fit in there. And so that would be my plan B if people just completely revolt over having Miami and UCF in the Southwest Conference. But it's not my first option. But let's go ahead and take a look at this map. Again, pretty similar, just the couple differences there, and then you got Big East. But what I want to do is take away all the noise and just look at those three conferences together in the two scenarios that we outlined. And this shows why I really think that this first option that I showed you is the better of the two options. You look at, yes, Florida, and you got Miami and UCF here that are ways away, but again, flying. But this looks like a conference. Yeah, they're separated by the Rockies and stuff, but this still makes sense. This isn't terrible. And look how nice and tidy the Big East is versus this, where either way, Florida is separated from the conference in both situations. And here, this is what I was talking about. The man, I don't know if you never learned it this way, but you got his hat, his face, and his nose. This is his body, his torso, his belly, his legs, and then his big old boots here. So anyway, there's a geography lesson, I guess. And I would have, and then you'd have Cincy and Louisville, who are still kind of over here, but ish. And but it makes sense. But I just think overall this one is better. And to go on again about the point about Florida, so going from Salt Lake to Dallas or Miami to Dallas is about the same either way. And so in those two scenarios, either way, you're going to have about the same distance from the two outlier schools into the heart of that Southwest Conference. And then when you look at Miami in this second situation, that's how far they are to Dallas, but look how far they are to the closest. That's just the closest member in the Big East. And you go all the way up to Morgantown, and that's going to get you quite a bit closer to this. And so again, Miami's still pretty far away from most of the members of its conference in either scenario, but I think they are a better fit into Dallas. And then you think about it too, that conference would have a lock on all the Texas schools as well as have a foothold into Florida. So when you talk about recruiting, I don't really know how those school members would have an issue with, hey, look, Texas is ours, and now we can go over to Florida and recruit too. I think that makes a lot of sense, which is why, again, I would go with the first scenario. And again, I'm commissioner, so I can do what I want. Anyway, as I mentioned, Notre Dame, and Josh made a good point. Notre Dame's always been independent, and they really prefer that. And I could be talked into them going independent. What that would allow is for UConn to move into that 10th spot in the Big East and elevate their football back up to power level. They still play in a power conference for basketball, the Big East, and now they would be back in this version of the Big East with their football program. So it'd save them. So I'd like that. Gets a big, and it feels right having the Big East with UConn and with some of these other schools, bringing those rivalries back together, even though some of those schools, I think BC did all it could behind the scenes to keep UConn out of getting an invite to the ACC. We're going to force them back together, and it'll be fun and juicy. And Big East basketball, well, this version of basketball and football is you got the band back together. So I think ultimately I could settle in on this version again, still with the Utah schools in the Big Eight, these two Florida schools in the Southwest Conference, and then bring in UConn in with those Big East schools. But let me know what you think. Which of my versions did you like the best? And how would you modify them if in any way? Or did you prefer what Josh Pate laid out? Did you like his version better than mine? Let me know in the comments. What would be your perfect conferences if you were commissioner? How would you do it? Please let us know. Also, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. We really appreciate it. And go Cougs.